Here with me, MS Now Justice and Intelligence reporter Ken Dilanian, former Biden Justice Department official Anthony Coley on set with me, and former U.S. Attorney and MS Now legal analyst Joyce Vance also here in the studio. Ken, I'm just going to start where we ended this conversation last hour with Congressman Subramaniam, who told me so far Bondi has only faced softball questions at that point from Republicans, but he was also ready to expand on who Bondi was really spending time talking about. I want to play for you just part of that interview.
One thing I would say is I do want to talk to Todd Blanche now. I'd like to subpoena Todd Blanche. I'd also like to subpoena Kash Patel as well, just based on what I've heard so far.
She's talking about Kash Patel in that room?
He has come up, yes.
Notable that he's saying that Kash Patel has come up, that Todd Blanche has come up, that those are two people that Bondi seems to be saying, well, I delegated that to Blanche, I delegated that to Kash. What does that signify to you?
Yeah, good morning, Ali. Look, those of us in Washington may have heard the sound of a large bus driving over a large object about an hour ago, and that was Pam Bondi throwing her former deputy Todd Blanche, now the acting attorney general, under that bus, proverbially. Let me just read the statement that came from her in her opening remarks. She said, as the head of a large department with broad responsibilities, I did not lead every aspect of this effort or conduct that document review myself. I delegated oversight of this process to Deputy Attorney General Todd Blanche. And that's actually been pretty clear for some time. I've been wondering myself why this committee wasn't trying to talk to Todd Blanche instead of Pam Bondi, who in many ways was a figurehead attorney general. Todd Blanche ran a lot of the DOJ while Pam Bondi was the attorney general. But nonetheless, there are some important questions for Pam Bondi. We all remember the moment when she didn't even want to turn around and face some of the Epstein survivors in the congressional hearing. She just handled this whole thing in a very odd way. And of course, we all remember when she said that the Epstein client list was sitting on her desk when there really isn't an Epstein client list. And then she handed out those binders of documents that really didn't contain anything to right-wing influencers. So there are some important questions for her. But I think the more pertinent questions really will be for Todd Blanche. And the biggest questions about the DOJ rollout, this DOJ, it's not really fair to ask why they didn't prosecute particular figures in the Epstein matter. Yeah. Those questions are really better put to Alex Acosta and people who handled this 10 years ago. But you can fairly ask about how they handled the rollout, why the information of victims was exposed, why certain documents pertaining to Trump were held back and then they appeared and then they were withdrawn again, whether there was an effort to protect Donald Trump. All those are fair game, and they will, I'm sure, be asked of very many people in this administration.
Yeah, and I think that that's something that several lawmakers plan to ask about. We are currently in the Democratic hour of questioning, should go on for another 20 or so minutes, is my understanding, according to sources. But, Anthony, I think the big question, too, is when you talk about Bondi, I love the way that Ken says this, driving a bus over Todd Blanche, rhetorically speaking right now, it begs the question of, DOJ. Mary McCord, who was here an hour ago, knows DOJ. It's not crazy that the AG would delegate this to her deputy attorney general, but then it starts begging questions about, okay, well, then who should we even be asking why the transparency was so botched in the first place? Because that defies the law that Congress passed.
Right. And the buck does stop with the head of the agency.
Totally.
Right. Let's just start there. But Pam Bondi, here's what's so interesting to me, Ali Vitale, about Pam Bondi. She was once an ally for survivors. If you go back and look at her time in Florida, I see Joyce nodding her head. She led the effort to get thousands of untested rape kits tested. Like, she got funding for that. She had this accountability brand. And so my question is, and I hope what Democrats are asking in this room, is how does she go from being in the trenches, fighting alongside survivors, to now running interference against them in the White House Situation Room? I mean, Ken talked about earlier how while she was Attorney General, she held a meeting in the White House Situation Room to try to convince Republican members of Congress to not sign on to this discharge petition, right, to force the release of the Epstein files, right? Todd Blanche didn't do that. Yep. That was her. And she owes the American people an answer to that. And more importantly, she owes the survivors an answer for this, right? They just want transparency and accountability. That's what they want. And she played a role in that, no matter how she tries to whitewash it now.
Yeah, and I do think it was striking to see at the start of the day that as Chairman Comer was taking questions from reporters, as he often does before these things, the survivors themselves were there to ask Comer questions about what they wanted to see from Bondi. I also wonder, in as much as it's interesting to hear her say, no, this was all Todd Blanche, A, how does Kash Patel come up in this? That's certainly something I'm interested in. And B, doesn't it allow Bondi the ability to just sort of pass the buck and not have to engage with these questions for an interview that, frankly, there was so much stonewalling and back and forth for, it wasn't clear that Bondi was even going to come in for this interview at all.
You know, the level of dysfunction at this Justice Department just continues to be gobsmacking.
Right.
I know Anthony feels the same way. Look, first, I think that we should say the Attorney General runs the organization, and it's simply not possible that a competent Attorney General wouldn't be getting daily updates on the rollout of the release of the Epstein files, both because it's an incredibly important Justice Department priority. The treatment of victims and survivors is in some ways statutorily mandated to happen according to a certain procedure, but also because politically, I mean, attorney generals do report to the president politically. It's important. So the idea that she can duck responsibility should be a non-starter. But beyond that, you ask, I think, just the right question. What's the role here for a Kash Patel or for a Todd Blanche? Because they were involved in the rollout. Congress has legitimate oversight obligations here. This was a botched rollout. They protected perpetrators. They exposed survivors. There needs to be accountability for that. It's unlikely we'll get that, frankly, in this hearing today, but it could be a start. Bondi may inadvertently reveal certain matters that could lead to other inquiries, or she may have a moment, because as Anthony says, her record as Attorney General in Florida early on, you know, she was involved in the early days of human trafficking prosecutions, as was I, sort of on that same timeline in that part of the country. And so her shift is remarkable.
The shift is remarkable, and it's certainly something that was even pointed out when she came up to testify before the House Judiciary Committee and wouldn't even turn to look at the survivors who were sitting at the back of the room. They were quite visible, all wearing the same color T-shirts. We all know them because they've been in the public eye now for years, just trying to get accountability. And so I wonder, as Democrats and Republicans continue with this investigation, with varying degrees of a desire to get to the bottom of it, what is the most substantive thread that could come out of this testimony today? Take out of it the fact that it's only transcribed, it's not on camera. Like, information is still information. What would be the best thing that Democrats could ask about?
You know, I'm gonna say something that the Democratic Party probably will not like here, which is that I'm glad they are doing this, and they should try to get transparency and accountability. But the answer, the transparency and the accountability that these survivors need is not going to come out of this process. I believe firmly that they need to pass new legislation that creates something like an independent federal monitor, right, with staffing, somebody like retired prosecutors and FBI agents, because what we know is that 50% of the Epstein files are still under wraps. And there is no way to confirm that the information that is under wraps is consistent with the law requiring disclosure. So DOJ itself is not an honest arbiter here, and we need an independent source, respected among both people of both parties, to actually get to the bottom of this.
Yeah, because in theory, it should be a nonpartisan thing, trying to get accountability
Yeah.
for these survivors of sex trafficking and abuse. You know, Ken, I think the other thing that I started the day thinking about was the fact that there are two DOJ officials in the room with Bondi. They're there to be basically agents on behalf of the DOJ because Bondi is there in her personal capacity. But if she's there in her personal capacity, it also means that she probably has her own legal representation there. Can you walk us through what's notable to you about this?
Yeah, that's actually pretty standard that the DOJ would send lawyers to represent their interests when a former official is testifying. And you're right. There's no doubt if I were Pam Bondi, I would have my own lawyer there as well. And for that reason, given that she's surrounded by lawyers, there's probably a lot of questions that she's not going to answer. And let's face it, the committee has very little leverage to demand those answers. She's not the Attorney General anymore. But it will be interesting. No doubt we will eventually see the transcript of this hearing. It'll be interesting to see what the DOJ tried to block her from answering. Because after all, the whole point of this, as you guys are all been talking about, is transparency at this point. I mean, what's left for these survivors? Really, there aren't going to be more prosecutions. What they hope for and expect is they want the information. They want to know what secrets are buried in these files about potentially other people who may have committed wrongdoing or potential incompetence or worse among prosecution efforts, among the Justice Department. That's what the public is owed here, and the DOJ should not be standing in the way of that. And if they are, we should all find out about it.
I think, Joyce, the other thing that a lot of attention has been paid to, perhaps rightly, is what it means that this is not the subpoena being enforced. And so it's not an under oath deposition. It is instead a transcribed interview, but you're still not allowed to lie to Congress. And so I wonder if you can help us understand the difference between lying to Congress and perjury, and why there is a difference, because many a lawyer has made it clear to me that although it seems like it's the same, it's apparently not.
Well, it's statutory, and this is a little bit of law school 101, but there's a specific statute that prohibits perjury, and it has to be a false statement made under oath with certain specifications. But there's also a more general crime in the United States Code that covers making false statements to the government. They have to be material. You have to know that they're false when you make them and intend to make a false statement. But that, too, can be prosecuted. You know, there's a whole lineage of those cases involving both congressional testimony but simply being interviewed by FBI agents. I think the interesting issue here, and Ken hinted at this, is whether Pam Bondi will try to duck giving answers to sensitive questions by trying to assert a variant of the presidential immunity that Donald Trump holds, saying that it extends to her as well as his former attorney general. That's an issue that's ripe for the Supreme Court to determine, and that could get interesting.